So I was asked to speak on the Theology of Laudato Si, which is a huge topic. So if you'll permit me, I'd like to just make a little more precise title, which of course is longer, as we must do in academics. Couldn't resist. So the Extinction of Creation and its Recovery, Insights from Laudato Si in the Catholic Tradition. And so one of the major ecological crises that we're confronting today is the accelerating loss of biodiversity, which is resulting in major extinction rates, thousands of species each year. In geologic history, there have always been extinctions, and sometimes mass extinctions, such as when the dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago. That was actually the fifth major extinction in geologic history, and before that there were four other major ones going back to 440 million years ago. Elizabeth Kolbert argues in her book on this page that we're currently in the midst of a sixth extinction, the Holocene extinction. Not something precipitated by a major catastrophic event like the meteor impact, which precipitated the extinction of the dinosaurs, but a gradual and constant line of extinctions over the past 10,000 years as humans have become more dominant on the earth. And one of the unique and concerning characteristics of this extinction is that no other extinction event in the history of the earth has been caused by just one species. And so we do have a particular responsibility for that. As Catholics, we should look at the problem, though, of the extinction of species, not just as a very real and sobering physical problem with serious material causes, and some of you may be working on that in your own research, but also as a spiritual problem, or actually as a metaphysical problem. And so my comments today are going to focus more on a kind of metaphysical extinction of creation that I believe underlies and has played a role in the physical extinctions we're experiencing. And this isn't just idle speculative thinking, because I believe it's essential for us to acknowledge that metaphysical aspect if we're truly to make progress toward reducing or slowing the physical extinctions of the Holocene. So I'll be drawing upon Laudato Si, as well as other elements in the Catholic intellectual tradition and my own Franciscan tradition. The encyclical is grounded in Franciscan spirituality, as Pope Francis says in the introduction. He also indicates that the encyclical is to be added to the Church's social teachings and that it builds naturally upon the teachings of his predecessors, Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI and St. John Paul II. And he mentions also Patriarch Bartholomew's legacy. But this is part of a long history of teachings regarding human nature and the nature of creation. Then in chapter 1, Pope Francis begins with the science. So he utilizes the science as an entrance point to dialogue, and that's a good model for us here. And in that chapter, he highlights particular ecological issues, so pollution and climate change, water quality and quantity, loss of biodiversity, along with the breakdown of society and the decline in our quality of life those issues have caused. After the science comes the theology in chapter 2, for, as the Pope says, science and theology can engage in an intense dialogue which is fruitful to both, so consistent with the mission of the society. And the Pope says Christians need to realize that their responsibility within creation and their duty towards nature and the Creator are an essential part of their faith. So I'll look a little bit more at the Gospel of Creation, that chapter in my lecture. Then after the science, the theology, then in chapter 3, he urges us to look inside ourselves. What are the human roots of the ecological crisis? Because as Steve said, how we are inside affects how we treat others in the world around us. And so the disorders we see around us find their roots in disordered attitudes within ourselves, what we could call a kind of polluted interior ecology. And he identifies two major roots, what he calls the technocratic paradigm and misguided anthropocentrism. And I'll talk about those as well. Then after we search our interior lives, we come to chapter 4 and the keystone of the encyclical, Integral Ecology, which is the marriage of natural and human ecology. And that's the Pope's answer to the ecological crisis, as I see it. Integral ecology is basically putting human ecology into relationship with natural ecologies and recognizing the distinctive human responsibilities inherent in those relationships. Some of those responsibilities revolve around macro solutions in economics and politics, and so he takes up those in chapter 5. Some will be micro solutions in terms of ecological conversion and ecological education, and that he takes up in chapter 6. My focus today will be on parts of chapters 2, 3, and 6, but this gives you the kind of the eagle's view. Okay. So here's what I'll cover. This is a big picture look. I live in West Michigan. We have a 230-acre farm, and we have someone taking drone images from above, and it's amazing how beautiful they are when you see them from above. And so that's what I hope I'm doing today with this talk. It's like a drone image of big pictures. So I won't be good, it's a survey. So the first part, the crisis, what's behind and beneath the extinction crisis, and how did we get here? Then what's the antidote from our tradition and the gospel of creation in particular from Laudato Si? How can it help us respond? And even further, what are the implications for how we live as Catholics? And I would like to propose 4 strategies there in that final section. Okay, so a little bit on analyzing the crisis. How did we get here? And what are some of the metaphysical causes underlying the physical extinction of species? In 1967, Lynn White wrote an article entitled The Historical Roots of the Ecological Crisis. And it was published in the Journal of Science and very widely read and accepted. And in it, he holds Christians responsible for the ecological crisis because of the biblical mandate in Genesis to subdue and dominate the earth. As a result of that account, he says, Christians believed their role in nature was to be dominators and that nature had no purpose other than to serve humans. His critique of Christianity has unfortunately been widely accepted and quoted over the past 50 years, and I'm sure most of you have heard it. But is that really the main cause behind the crisis? I'd like to consider another historical factor, a kind of contrasting explanation, or at least bring it into the dialogue. And in his wonderful book, In the Beginning, A Catholic Understanding of the Story of Creation and the Fall, Pope Benedict XVI proposed that the root of the ecological crisis is not Christianity, but rather modernity and the progressive metaphysical disappearance of the notion of creation that has occurred since the Enlightenment. So we have 2 different explanations here, and I'd like to expand on Pope Benedict's argument a bit in the next couple of slides to consider in broad strokes the Enlightenment roots of the ecological crisis. In the 16th century, a dramatic change began to occur as we transitioned from the medieval to the Enlightenment periods. Some of it related to philosophical divergences, for example, with the pantheism of Giordano Bruno, who abandoned the Christian world view of the world as dependent upon God, and he championed a return to the Greek Platonic visions of a divine cosmos, where the world itself doesn't need to depend on God because it is God. Some of it related to a change of mind that accompanied the emergence of the speculative sciences. And I'm not being critical of the scientific enterprise here, but I think we need to be aware of the historical implications, beginning with Francis Bacon, the father of empiricism. Bacon promoted scientific experimentation and inductive reasoning, and he celebrated the power that we can achieve through our capacity to break down nature into its parts through deliberate experiments. You have power because once you know the efficient causes of things, you can produce that cause at will. And to wrest the secrets of nature, says Bacon, one must, quotes, force nature out of her natural state and squeeze and mold her. So here we see the roots of an emerging dominion view of humans in nature. Immanuel Kant celebrated Bacon's approach in his Critique of Pure Reason as the definitive triumph over the ancient philosophy of nature that had formed the foundations of medieval Christian philosophy. After Bacon, Galileo established a new mathematical science of nature, but it was up to Descartes to bring together the science of nature with the practical science of technology. The great goal and ambition of his work was to supplant the speculative knowledge of the ancient schools with a practical philosophy, and thus render ourselves like the masters and possessors of nature. So in Descartes, by the time we get to Descartes, we find a strongly instrumentalized picture of humans and of nature, a strongly anthropocentric ideal of humans as dominators and masters of the natural world. Now, I'm not trying to claim that Christians are totally exempt from Lynn White's critique, but certainly we have to acknowledge that there is a definitive Enlightenment contribution to this exaggerated image of humans as the dominators of nature. And we can see how it could lead to a false sense of the overwhelming power that we have as humans, and eventually perhaps to humans usurping God. And what happens then to the non-human creation when we do this? So I'll take this up in the next slide. Creation is basically reduced to an independent, self-sufficient reality which we experiment upon. We want to determine its material nature, and we can tend to see it as nothing more than physical reality. As this change of mind begins to dominate Western thought with modernity, we see the outgrowth of the Enlightenment practical philosophy, which progressively obscured the idea of creation and replaced it with nature. In effect, with modernity, creation is taken out of God's hands, and gradually there's a progressive sundering of creation from the Creator. And if there's no creation but only nature, there's no need for a creator. Over time, the whole situation flips and kind of plays a trick on us, for we end up in the situation that Vatican II lamented, where without the creator, the creature disappears. Or when God is forgotten, the creature itself grows unintelligible. We don't know how to understand one another anymore. We don't know who we are and what our role is in the created world. And so we end up in the sad situation that John Paul II decries, that when man uses things without reference to the Creator, he does incalculable harm to himself. And we see that in the ecological crisis around us. And then finally, if we want to go another step, in Pope Benedict XVI's words, the human being becomes a disturber of the peace, the one who wrecks everything, the real parasite and disease of nature. And unfortunately, we do hear this view of humans as the disease of nature and the cause of all our problems quite often, and sometimes in secular ecological analyses as well. And hopefully this helps us understand a little bit better how we got there. Now, just to show you an example of this, this mentality, well, you can see, the technocratic paradigm kind of leads us toward this mentality. So that takes us to Pope Francis now and the two human roots that he identifies in chapter 3. So the first, as I mentioned, is what he calls the technocratic paradigm. And the second is what he calls a misguided anthropocentrism. So we don't know our place and who we are in the world. And we can understand these two human roots a little better when we look at the Enlightenment progression that we've just looked at into modernity. And we can see sort of the onslaught of the practical science of nature and the development of technology and how we can get caught in technocracy. And so, but I'm not criticizing the use of technology, so please keep working for us all day. But in the technocratic view, we get reduced to, ugly bags of mostly water. That's who we are. So a little more on the technocratic paradigm, and I love this quote in Laudato Si'. It's actually taken from Romano Guardini, whose work I really appreciate. But that we're not against technology per se, but the technocratic paradigm is a kind of ideology that's problematic, and this is what he's stressing in the encyclical. Because in the past, as we see in this quote, we always intervened in nature, but it meant being kind of in tune with nature and the possibilities that were in nature and sort of receiving those possibilities. what nature itself allowed within its limits. But now we lay our hands on things, says Guardini, and try to extract everything possible from them while ignoring really what is the nature of the reality in front of us. And so we end up with a situation where technology is actually exalting the concept of a subject gaining control over an external object, possessing it, mastering it, transforming it by using technique and according to logical and rational procedures. That's not bad, but it can be taken to an extreme where we treat nature as if it's something formless and completely open to manipulation. And so he says what's been handed on to us is a model of super development dominated by a Promethean view of mastery over the world and an exaltation of technology as sort of the solution to all of our problems. The technological development hasn't been accompanied by a corollary development in human values, and it has ended up obscuring the true nature of the reality around us in favor of a kind of technical constructiveness. And at breakfast we were talking about Houston and the way they try to design flood control, which is just contrary to all the laws of nature, and then we wonder why we have floods every time we have a bad storm there. And I think you can probably identify with that wherever you live. What happens with this too, and I find this very concerning, we lose the sense of limits that are inherent in all of created reality, including ourselves and including our bodies also. And we've replaced it with an extractive mentality that tends to be after our own self-fulfillment and often ends up discarding whatever's perceived as not directly useful for a technological advance. And then we end up discarding not only things, as we know from the vast quantities of waste that we produce, but also people. So people on the edges, people whose sufferings we don't wish to see in our Promethean view of reality. And we get caught in a throwaway culture, says the Pope, where we throw away people just as we throw away things. And so this situation leads us to a kind of schizophrenia between this technocratic paradigm where we don't see any value in lesser beings other than ourselves, but the other extreme where we see no special value in human beings, and in fact, we tend to think of ourselves as the disease of nature. But the Pope says we cannot prescind from humanity. There can be no renewal of our relationship with nature without a renewal of humanity itself, and that's a constant theme in the encyclical. I recently came across this diagram in an article about how to develop ecologically sensitive urban spaces. The author shows this kind of sense of schizophrenia in his juxtaposition between what he calls the ego versus the eco approaches. And in the ego approach, of which he's critical, the human is the dominator, top of the pile. In its place, yay! In its place, he proposes the eco-image, where humankind is part of the ecosystem, not apart from or above it. And he emphasizes, that's a quote from the article. The ecocentric view is favored by many ecologists and has also been called biocentrism. Basically, though, there is a problem with this position because it can lead to the conclusion that the value of human life is indistinguishable from the value of the life of other creatures. And in Laudato Si, the Pope is critical of both these extremes. He deplores the exalted view of humans as dominators because it has made us feel entitled to plunder nature at will. At the same time, in response to the biocentric position, he says in paragraph 118, when the human person is considered as simply one being among others, then our overall sense of responsibility wanes. A misguided anthropocentrism need not necessarily yield to biocentrism, for that would entail adding yet another imbalance, failing to solve present problems and adding new ones. Human beings cannot be expected to feel responsibility for the world unless at the same time their unique capacities of knowledge, will, freedom, and responsibility are recognized and valued. So getting our anthropology right is extremely important, and as I mentioned, the Pope emphasizes that there can be no ecology without an adequate anthropology. So neither of these models really looks to be the correct one. They both have elements of truth in them, but they don't really represent the fullest version of who we are and who we can be in the created world. So let's look at what the gospel of creation gives us in chapter 2. How can we find our way back? And just to note that any photos from here on in are from our land, are at the Franciscan Life Process Center in West Michigan. And it's a joy for me to be able to share some of the beauty of our land with you. I'd like to begin with what I see as one of the key paragraphs in the encyclical, paragraph 66, where the Pope writes, "Human life is grounded in three fundamental and closely intertwined relationships: with God, with our neighbor, and with the earth itself." So we've all heard the prime commandments to love God and love our neighbor. Here, the Pope emphasizes that we are to love the earth as well. This has always been part of the Catholic intellectual tradition, but he's making it more explicit or giving it elevating its priority in this paragraph. And so for us as Catholics, it makes a difference how we treat the created world. It's not just arbitrary. And as the Pope says, living our vocation to be protectors of God's handiwork is essential to a life of virtue. It's not an optional or secondary aspect of our Christian experience. So that third leg is very important. It can't be isolated from the other two, as I think you referred to Steve. So taking care of these three prime relationships is essential to our Christian lives and to our Catholic lives, and I think this is the essence of integral ecology as it is portrayed in the encyclical. So now let's look at what the Gospel of Creation has to say about creation and about the nature of human persons. That will be my main emphasis. There's lots more in this chapter, which I encourage you to read. So for the nature of creation, one thing we can say up front is creation is not the same as nature. And so here we see a corrective to the gradual obscuring of the notion of creation that occurred in the Enlightenment, and a re-emphasis that creation is a theological term, and it should be taught as such. So I think we really need to teach this as a key element in our curricula, in our Catholic schools and seminaries. Creation is of the order of love. It's a revelation of the outpouring of God's love on the world. It's a gift. Creation is gift. And that concept really, our young people need to hear that. Because it is of the order of love and its gift, each organism as a creature of God has an intrinsic value independent of its usefulness. And each creature has a place, a niche, as we call it in ecology, not just an ecological niche, which is important, but also a spiritual niche, a spiritual place in the harmony of creation as ordained by the Creator. So when we lose that, we're losing something very special, because we're losing that aspect of God that's represented there. Each creature speaks a message to us, and as humans, we need to learn to listen to the message. And St. Francis of Assisi was an exemplar of this, learning how to hear the message of creatures and the harmony of creation. Now, who are we as creatures? First of all, we must recognize, says the Pope, that we are not God. At the same time, each of us is the result of a thought of God. Each of us is willed. Each of us is necessary. Each of us is loved. We're not a meaningless product of evolution. We did arrive in our current physical form through evolutionary processes, but we're a special creature, created in the image and likeness of God. We have material bodies, but we also have spiritual capacities and an eternal destiny. And what is our role in creation? It's not to be a master and dominator, says the Pope. And here he does respond to the Lynn White critique of Christianity by saying that the charge that Judeo-Christian thinking on the basis of the Genesis account has encouraged the unbridled exploitation of nature by painting him as domineering and destructive by nature is not a correct interpretation of the Bible as understood by the Church. He acknowledges that there might be some elements of truth in White's claim because we Christians haven't always correctly interpreted the scriptures, but he says we must forcefully reject the notion that our being created in God's image and given dominion over the earth justifies absolute dominion over other creatures. And instead, he says, if we read the biblical text in context with an appropriate hermeneutic, they teach us that the proper role of humans is to till and keep the garden of the world. And tilling refers to cultivating, plowing, or working. And keeping refers to caring, protecting, overseeing, and preserving. This is what all of you are trying to do in your own work. So we're not called to dominate the earth, but to live in harmony with it, to help it bring forth its fruits. And even, he says, we are called to reconcile ourselves with every creature. So while we have a special place in creation, we have to live in creation with humility, because as special as we are, we're not God, and we do need to remember that. And sometimes we forget it, especially when we see ourselves as masters and dominators, whether it's in our engineering, our ways of growing food, our biotechnologies, our ways of reproduction even. Now, a little addendum about this call to reconciliation. It's a tall order. And I put this up because I have to give a little confession here, because I struggle a great deal with mosquitoes. And they're more than annoying, and they carry disease. They cause so much suffering. And in fact, I have a priest friend in Houston who said, why evolutionarily, he's a theologian, but he said, why evolutionarily would mosquitoes cause us discomfort? Because if what they did to us was a sweet experience, we wouldn't try to exterminate them. And I thought, yeah, maybe that'll be in something evolutionary development in the future. It's an interesting question. But they do cause us discomfort. And when I taught a theology and ecology class in Houston, I would tease about my aversion to mosquitoes. And I sometimes gave a point of extra credit for anybody on the final who could articulate a good, coherent reason, either in ecology or theology, for the intrinsic value of mosquitoes. And I got sometimes the answers in this comic, like there would be only half the number of migratory birds if mosquitoes disappeared from the Arctic grasslands. And that's a very good answer. But I think the best answer I received was from one student who wrote, "Perhaps one reason God afflicted us with mosquitoes was to preserve our humility in the face of such a tiny creature that can cause us so much distress." So I try to think of that every time I get annoyed by a mosquito. Growing humility, sister. Okay, so what we end up with is really, I think, a balanced view in Chapter 2 in Laudato Si. And I believe it's the antidote, as it were, for the two human roots of the technocratic paradigm and the misguided sense of who we are. So what the gospel of creation is calling us to do is to listen to the created world attentively, so that we can actually feel the desertification of the soil almost as a physical ailment, and the extinction of species as a painful disfigurement. I teach an intro to environmental science class now, and I usually start the class by asking the students to share with me in writing a place that has been very special to them in their lives and how they would feel if something happened to it, to pollute it. And the responses are just beautiful, and that's the kind of identification we need to become more conscious of. And to experience this kind of identification and really deep care for the created world, we can't shirk our human responsibilities and the tremendous capacities that we have. So putting all creatures on the same level or going so far as to divinize the earth at worst is a kind of escapism, or at best it's a backing down or an abnegating of our responsibility. And if we do this, says the Pope, this will create new imbalances that will deflect us from the reality that's challenging us. And so everything is interconnected, and I think we need to be aware of that. So the kind of attachment and love for the created world to which we're called as Catholics does entail this posture of attentive listening, a willingness to co-suffer, if you will, with degraded landscapes and with endangered species, to feel their loss as our own. And this is the kind of internal conversion or restoration of our internal ecology that's required for true ecological conversion. And ultimately, I would say, for the restoration of our exterior ecologies. So now, if I could, I'd like to look at 4 strategies that I think would help us in learning to live this faith. So we have a great theoretical base, but how do we actually live this as Catholic scientists? And I would suggest maybe there's an opportunity for the new evangelization here, for maybe unleashing some aspects of the new evangelization through practicing this kind of ecological conversion. So I'm proposing 4 strategies. They're not exhausted, and they're my own thoughts. They're based on the teachings in Laudato Si, but I do have to claim full responsibility. But I propose them because I think they hold promise for how we as Catholics can really make a palpable difference in responding to ecological questions. They involve working toward the metaphysical recovery of creation, but I believe in the long run they'll assist us in the physical recovery of creation, because if we get the metaphysics right, the physics will follow along. Right, Steve? So first, return to the sources, recover a proper anthropology, learn and mimic the grammar of creation, and finally, recover and live a sacramental vision of the cosmos. And so again, these aren't exhaustive, but I do believe that working on these together could be steps toward the kind of ecological conversion and the integral ecology that Pope Francis is calling for. So return to the sources. Marie George will be speaking later, and she'll speak in much more detail on this. So again, this is broad brush. But there's more on this in an article I published with John Hittinger in New Black Flyers if you want more information. And I should preface this by saying, so I'm just going to focus a little bit on Aquinas and Bonaventure, again from the drone view. They're among the sources upon which the encyclical is founded, and any reading of Laudato Si apart from them isn't really an inclusive or the fullest reading. Both are referenced at various points in the encyclical. In paragraph 86, Pope Francis speaks about Aquinas' vision that the biodiversity we see in the natural world is a reflection of God's divine goodness, inasmuch as God's goodness cannot be represented fittingly by any creature. Such a beautiful view of the biodiversity. Now, for Aquinas, creation is the continual, complete causing of the very being of all that is. And so the created world reflects God's original and ongoing creative causality. For him to create is to produce a thing into being according to its entire substance, ex nihilo. It's not change. Oftentimes that gets mixed in the language today. Creation is not change. It's the conferral of being, giving of being by the first cause, who's God. And so any misunderstanding of the nature of creation leads to a misunderstanding necessarily about the nature of God. And we could hear this, I think, in the quotes from Gaudium et Spes earlier. Bonaventure, the famous Franciscan, is known for his metaphysics of exemplarism, which refers to God's self-expressive goodness in things, because goodness has to communicate itself. And for Bonaventure, it's all about relationship. So creation means a relation, since the creature depends essentially and totally on the Creator. And creation, says Bonaventure, bears a Trinitarian stamp, which is so beautiful, because it was created by the Trinitarian God out of the overflowing goodness and love between the Father, Son, and Spirit. Creation, then, is essentially sacramental, because the Son, as the image or exemplar of the Father, is the Word with a capital W, expressing and impressing himself on creation. So then creation becomes a little word with a small w, speaking of God to us like vestiges or footprints which we can follow on our spiritual journey to God. Creation is a book in which the Creator can be read through the words of created things. And so in the Franciscan spirit, our contemplation deepens the more we learn to encounter God in creatures outside ourselves. And so we could go far toward the metaphysical recovery of creation if we reintroduce these understandings of creations in our Catholic schools and universities. Okay, now, anthropology. So again, the question of who we are and what our role is really critical. The technocratic paradigm tends to reinforce that misguided image. So I would say we need new images. We need new images of humans, and not on top of the pile, I think in the middle. St. Bonaventure pictures humans as mediators, with our feet planted firmly on the ground, but in upright posture, able to carry creation back with us to God. we just need new images because the ego and the eco images just don't cut it. So I've been working on a particular image of the human person as gardener. And I think there's a lot of promise there. And I would encourage creative activity on the part of all of you to reflect on this. This artistic image by Jules Breton captures something essential for me, I think, about the nature of humans in creation. And again, I think we need to make this a priority in our Catholic education to help correct the confusion in the culture and emphasize the distinctiveness of humans in the created order, while at the same time that this doesn't mean being a master dominator, but rather something like a gardener or whatever images you come up with, so that we can learn the rhythms in creation, listen to the song of the lark on our way out to the fields, and help to bring forth fertility in creation according to its natural rhythms. Third strategy, so learn and mimic the grammar of creation, because God has written a precious book whose letters are the multitude of created things present in the universe. Those are John Paul II's words quoted in Laudato Si. And this is one I think is especially pertinent for ecologists, as you'll see in a moment. Each creature has a message to speak in the harmony of creation. No creature is excluded from that, so that all nature is a continuing revelation of the divine, a continuing revelation of God, really. And when we view nature in this way and contemplate it in this way, we will be able to discover in each thing a teaching which God wishes to hand on to us. And you might already have discovered that in your own work as scientists. I've always found that very exciting myself, that I'm discovering something that God wanted to communicate through his creatures. Now, if we can get this, here's an example, I think, of how we might do this in our science. Now, ecological restoration is where I used to do work when I was doing more research. So this one really grabbed me about the role of beavers. So we'll see how we... Okay, that wasn't a commercial for Utah State, but I just thought it was great. Oh, sorry. So I think that gives us an example of... How did we get this here? Okay. Of the kind of sort of low-tech but harmonious ecological restoration and engineering, that there are lots of possibilities out there for us. And then finally, recover a sacramental view of the cosmos. I think this one is really important, and I'm trying to do more work on this these days. I had a presentation on this last weekend. That's because being sacramental is a key part of who we are as Catholics, right? So how does that affect our ecological vision and worldview and our place? With the sacramental vision, we don't bypass the physical. Rather, it's through the physical that we get to the spiritual. That's the sacramental process, as we can see in Paul and Corinthians. And that vision derives its ultimate reality from the incarnate Son of God. So all the creatures in the material universe find their true meaning in the incarnate Word, because he incorporated in his person part of the material world. And so the very flowers of the field and the birds which his human eyes contemplated and admired are now imbued with his radiant presence. So the material world contains like the imprint of the incarnate God, making it both a material and a spiritual reality. So sacramentality is that sensible bond between the material and spiritual worlds. And I believe that recovering a sacramental view of the cosmos is extremely important, because I see it as the answer to so many of the crises that got us to where we are today. It's the answer to the pantheism, which Giordano Bruno, to which he succumbed in the 16th century, and which persists to this day. Pantheism defines the world as God, but in the sacramental vision, on the other hand, we see God's vestiges or footprints in creation, while at the same time recognizing that he's transcendent. So the Christian God is both immanent and transcendent. And one way we can relate to him, one very important way, is through our connection with material realities in the sacramental vision. A sacramental view of the cosmos also counters materialism and the technocratic paradigm, because all reality is imbued with spiritual meaning. It's speaking a spiritual message to us. It's not just of our making to be molded and extracted for our own purposes. So Catholics are sacramental people. We're incarnational people, embodied. We have an embodied faith. in which matter matters. So not just for what it can provide for us, but for what it is. And a sacramental vision, in fact, elevates the value of materiality and value. So each element in the material world is sort of elevated, and that includes also the human body because it has a kind of dignity, because it has a spiritual element to it. Now, so living sacramentally, I just have a few comments on this. G.K. Chesterton wrote a wonderful biography of St. Francis of Assisi, and he wrote that the core of Francis's life was the ultimate recovery, not the ultimate refusal of material things. And that's what the sacramental vision is about, the ultimate recovery of material things. And isn't recovering creation what we're all about as ecologists? It's also about what we're about as Catholics, who adhere to a sacramental worldview and who live sacramentally. And so while it might not be spelled out this way in the encyclical, I'll just step out and suggest that this is ultimately what the Pope's proposal of integral ecology is about. So basically living a sacramental relationship with God, with others, and with the earth. Living these sacramental relationships requires an interior conversion, an ecological conversion that's not only physical but also spiritual, not only exterior but also interior. And recognizing the link between that exterior and interior conversion is important because, as Pope Benedict said so well, the exterior deserts of the world are growing because the interior deserts have become so vast. And we have a lot of interior deserts in our culture, whether it's deserts of dominance or deserts of despair because we're thinking of ourselves as the disease of nature. But I think living sacramentally can help us heal our internal and external ecologies. And how do we do this? We can do it on a number of levels. So pictured here were various land experiences. So we're restoring a native prairie on our land or preparing food together. And the land experiences aren't just to get the work done, but their goal is to be sacramental experiences that touch something of the interior of the human person. So the reason why I have these compost piles here, which are in the process of decomposing, is that there are many wonderful analogies there about the interior composting that needs to be done in order for this kind of conversion to occur. And we find that people who work on the compost pile really respond to that. And then, of course, on higher, so we bring people in through those elemental experiences, and then we hope we can bring them further to, another level of sacramental living, so the beautiful sacramentals we celebrate, the Easter fire, Corpus Christi procession, Stations of the Cross, and of course, at the summit is our celebration of the Eucharist. And so when we live as sacramental people, we can discover truly who we are as humans and who we're meant to be. And I would say the ultimate corrective to the metaphysical extinction of creation and its ecological aftermath is this statement in paragraph 83 of the encyclical. The ultimate purpose of other creatures is not to be found in us. Rather, all creatures are moving forward with us and through us toward a common point of arrival, which is God. Human beings endowed with intelligence and love and drawn by the fullness of Christ are called to lead all creatures back to their Creator. So just as we're called to help each other get to heaven, we're also called to bring the created world into its fulfillment in God. And believe me, I'm not saying this is easy. It's challenging, it can be messy, unclear, think of the compost pile, even smelly, because it involves touching things and even people that are messy, disordered, neglected, and it often requires sacrifices on our part. So think of the ultimate sacrifice of Christ that we celebrate in the Eucharist. But as messy as it can be, in that messiness, it can also be joyful and celebratory. And that, I think, is the true mark of sacramental living.